Children's Cancer Cause welcomes Dr. Greg Aune to our conversation series. Dr. Aune is the Greehey Distinguished University Chair for Cancer Survivorship in Children, the Stephanie Edlin Distinguished Professor of Pediatric Cancer Research at the Greehey Children's Cancer Research Institute, and a tenured Associate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Texas, San Antonio. His experience in pediatric cancer spans over 30 years and encompasses his own patient experiences, research in experimental therapeutics, clinical care of pediatric oncology patients, and childhood cancer advocacy. So as both a pediatric cancer survivor and a pediatric oncologist, we've asked Dr. Aune to share his unique experiences as a panelist for the recent meeting sponsored by Children's Cancer Cause on reducing cardiac late effects in pediatric cancer patients and survivors. The meeting was part of an FDA-approved, externally led, patient-focused drug development conference, or PFDD, which is an FDA program established 10 years ago to more systematically gather information directly from patients and caregivers about their perspectives on their condition, available treatments, and the impact on daily living and long-term health. So welcome, Dr. Aune, and thank you for speaking with us today about some key takeaways from the PFDD meeting. So why is the patient, survivor, caregiver perspective so important when it comes to FDA's work?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the FDA's, I guess, primary role is to oversee one of their primary roles is to oversee the development of new drugs, and in this case, new drugs for pediatric cancers and cancer in general. I don't think you can do that effectively without understanding what the patients experience. So I really applaud the efforts to try to understand, where the limitations are in oncology care, and we've made a lot of progress over the last, 8 decades, 80 to 90 years in improving outcomes for cancers of all type, and children have done exceedingly well with survival rates now, more than 80%, a 5-year survival rate. But I think there's a lot more that can be done. A 5-year survival rate doesn't address at all the quality of life that patients have, and a lot of what we talked about in the meeting really focuses on the quality of life patients have, and you truly aren't successful in curing someone's cancer if, when they're done with their treatments, they have a range of severe health problems. And some of the stories we heard in the meeting were just unbelievable, with the cardiac complications that patients from all over the country have had to endure after they successfully overcame their cancer diagnosis.
As a pediatric cancer survivor, what were the most important messages that were shared by survivors and caregivers during the meeting?
I'm always, I find it very motivating to hear the stories from all the patients. And I work in, I take care of patients, I do research on survivorship issues, and then I go to and involved in many of the national efforts to, I think, raise awareness about survivorship and help those patients. But I'm always blown away at the stories. When I first got into this, I knew my own history of having, valve disease and coronary artery disease and all that entailed. And I think initially I thought I was an outlier, but I think over time, as I've met other people, I'm not an outlier. I'm actually the norm in many respects. And I think some of the stories we heard in the meeting were just unbelievable. Kids dying when they were young from a heart failure, people in their 30s that had developed severe symptoms. These things are life limiting. People aren't able to achieve what they would have been able to achieve because they're so burdened by health consequences. And to me, the take home is we're nowhere near, having overcome cancer in children. Their survival rates sound great, and I think they're they're used a lot, in various venues, both in research and in the lay media, but it just doesn't tell the whole story, and that's really not what we're after. And the types of outcomes we talked about in the meeting are what really need to be highlighted, and people need to understand this, and it needs to go outside of our world of pediatric oncology advocates and survivorship advocates. And leaders and philanthropists need to understand what's happening so that we can improve our outcomes for our patients, because if we keep doing what we're doing, this is what we're going to get. And I don't want to see people have to suffer like that, because it's a lot to overcome for people.
Right. I think that is a really important message, what you stated earlier, that your experience is closer to the norm than being an outlier. And I think that's really important for people to understand.
Well, and I think, honestly, I think because of the way, the culture of oncology over the last, many decades has been so focused on acute treatment and presenting cancer to patients as, just get through it. It's a battle or it's a war you got to win. Sometimes the downside of that is that the patients don't understand that it's a lifetime diagnosis, and so they go through this and then they're left with health problems. And you can talk with them. Oftentimes patients will tell you they feel abandoned by their oncology team after they're done with their treatment, because it's not an active cancer case anymore, and then the infrastructure and the recognition of all these late effects is not necessarily in place to care for them for the rest of their life. And then I think they're kind of worn down by the fact that they have all these health problems, but yet have to navigate a really complex healthcare system that isn't designed for that.
Right. But it's a lifelong situation, healthcare situation that
Sure.
folks are having to deal with. In what ways do you think other survivors and caregivers found value from participating in the meeting as panelists or attending the PFDD meeting?
I think there's tremendous value to giving patients an opportunity to tell their stories. I think that can be healing for people, to just get out there and talk about what they went through. I think it's part of acceptance. And I've gone through this, obviously, but you can't go back and change what happened to you. You can't go back and not take the treatment. You can't go back and change the sequence of events in your health. All you can do is try to be as healthy as you can. And sometimes I think talking about that is very helpful. It's helpful for parents of these children, and even adult parents of adult survivors. Often I think this is helpful. I also think they want to be heard. I think there's frustration out there that, and I feel this, on the, as an oncologist going into a patient's room and knowing that we're going to give them the same set of drugs that we give, other patients that we know is going to carry the risk of heart disease and lifelong late effects. And yet we're kind of powerless to do anything else because there just isn't anything available yet. I mean, we can try our best and we're making great strides, but we're just not there yet. It's just, I'm constantly reminded like how far we have to go. And I think if you're not doing that as an oncologist, maybe you're not in the right field. I think we need to challenge ourselves. And I think our patients expect us to do that. And I think that's one thing you can take away from this meeting is patients are really, I hope they feel like they were heard in their families.
Right. And how empowering that can be when they feel like they have a chance to tell their story and they feel like they're being heard. It's very empowering.
Well, I think the outcome, like, I know our ototoxicity meeting from a few years ago, I think it was just yesterday, we got word that the FDA approved sodium thiosulfate for the treatment of ototoxicity. And that was one of the central things, central interventions discussed at that meeting. It was fascinating. And I think good things came out of it. So, and the patient's voice had a huge part in, I think, helping push that through.
Right. That was really exciting news. And it does show that programs like this and meetings like this can make a serious difference in the treatment of kids with cancer. As a pediatric oncologist who does both research and treats patients, what other key messages did you take from the meeting?
Well, I think the overarching theme of just, that we have to listen to the patients, take that information in, be honest about what the outcomes are. It's like a lot of times, this is going to sound negative, but I think in our field, there's almost a desire to like pat ourselves on the back because we have an 80% survival rate. And again, I think you have to be honest about what does that mean? What do the patients look like? And is that something we'd want for our own, our own children or ourselves as an outcome? And I don't think anybody would choose that. So that means we have to do better. And the takeaway is we have to apply, what these patients are telling us to our own research and to our clinical systems. I mean, a big part of survivorship care is a gap in, where do these patients go when they need survivorship care? They turn 18 and then transition to an adult world. I'm hopeful that we've done a better job of educating this generation of survivors about their risks, but I feel like we've educated them and thrown them into a system that has no capacity to truly care for them. So they're kind of just forced to navigate their own way to get that care. And if they're, resourceful and have the connections, they can do it. If not, then I worry they're going to have a lot of health problems that we could have done better at taking care of. And I just think it reiterates that we have to not accept, this meeting to me reiterates that we can't accept that we've accomplished everything we need to as a field, that we have a long ways to go. And hopefully, I think the panelists and the patients there think that. I think everybody involved from a research and clinical standpoint thinks the same thing, speakers, etc. What we need to do is get that outside of the, the circles that participate in that meeting and really kind of spread the word.
Right, and that's a message that Children's Cancer Cause is really working on, and trying to provide resources and information to people about this whole issue of transitioning of care from pediatric oncology care to pediatric primary care, or from or into adult non-oncology care. There's some really critical issues and things that need to be done to help in those transitions. So, in what ways do you think other researchers and healthcare providers who were at the meeting, what do you think they got of value from that?
Again, I think hearing the patients, you hear certain stories, and it's like taking care of a patient with something that's dramatic like that. I think hearing the story can have the same effect on someone. It really, I think, solidifies in their consciousness what can happen to these patients. And then hopefully, if you're involved in, drug development, or you're involved in clinical trials for pediatric cancer, hopefully remembering some of the content that you encountered this meeting will help, hopefully put us on a better track to avoiding these kinds of things in the future. And just people will be more open-minded about, recognizing that we haven't solved all the problems, and it isn't all just let's go find a bunch of new medicines and we're going to get rid of the late effects problems, because that's really not the way that's going to happen. I think there has to be a lot more strategic thinking about how we're going to, move forward in the future of oncology for children.
Right. Are there important messages from the patient and the caregiver perspective that industry might have learned from during this meeting as well?
Well, I mean, I think the take home for industry is that peds cancers are under-researched, and that's a tough sell to get them to look into, cancers that are rare. But I think there's still tremendous opportunity to develop new medicines for childhood cancers. But then the bigger part of it is, I think, recognizing that, better systems to potentially identify late or off-target, acute effects and the potential for late effects in their studies is really important. I think sometimes industry is hesitant to do research in children's cancers because of the long trajectory and the worry that things they introduce into the patient population may, carry lifelong risks for the patients. But that shouldn't be a reason not to steer away from that, because the patients need it. I think families are willing to take those risks, provided there's some type of system in place to follow the patients over time. So that's historically what we've, I think, not done well is, do clinical trials and then follow patients for 20, 30 years afterwards because it's so expensive and time consuming. But to me, that's the expectation. Otherwise, I think we're going to just make the same mistake again, where we assume that, some targeted medicine or some new treatment strategy is going to have no effects, but it works great in carrying as an anti-cancer agent. But then if we don't follow the patients, we're not going to know, and then we'll find out, 20 years later, there's some, severe off-target effect that's causing problems. So I think that, to me, I hope they understand you have to build more of this into the systems. They may, need some incentives to do that, which I would be in favor of, and I think a lot of people will be in favor of. Forcing them to, I don't think is a solution. I think they're just going to choose to not do that. So I think incentives are the way to get them to think more about, how can we bring some of these things to children, and how do we do it in a way that hopefully lessens the risks that we're going to get late effects in, the new products that are coming through.
Right. Another issue that our organization cares deeply about is how can we speed up less toxic and better treatments for these kids with cancer. How do you think all this information and the perspective from survivors and caregivers might make a difference in FDA's evaluation of drugs?
Well, I hope it makes a big difference. I mean, I hope they're more willing to consider, potential intervention strategies that come through, because I think they will. I think there's some cardiovascular interventions that likely will be tested in early phase clinical trials and potentially want an indication for specific populations of survivors. So that's the first thing. And then I hope it spurs them to keep pushing for more of that. I think there's a big opportunity, actually, if they focus on the key, some of the key late effects that patients get. I mean, the population of survivors is growing, and this was about childhood cancer survivors, but a lot of the things that childhood cancer survivors get, adult survivors of cancer, we're finding have similar issues. So, I think there's the likelihood that some of these interventions or strategies may have a bigger market than people realize. And that should resonate with the industry, and then FDA would have to, help, move those particular interventions through their system and help get approvals. But I think the patients need that. I think the patients will be willing to take things.
Yeah. So, given the outcome that we had from the 2018 PFDD on hearing loss and the positive news we heard recently, and the impact of this meeting that we just had on cardiac late effects, what are some other treatment-induced late effects that we might address in future PFDDs?
So I thought about this, and I think I can think of 3 that I think are fairly common, that if you see survivors in clinic, there's a lot of frustration. So I think one is infertility. I think there's a lot of things. I mean, it's a issue. I think there's been a lot of, it's a big issue for patients, both. And I think you have to take females and males separately, because there's different considerations, obviously, for how to preserve their fertility based on their sex. I think there's been a lot of good studies trying to enhance fertility in survivors, but I don't know, how far we've come in actually implementing those, and what else there may be out there that might be helpful. So that's, infertility. The second one is neurocognitive late effects. So there's a lot of, patients that get repeated intrathecal therapy or get radiation to the CNS, or even patients that get chemotherapy. There's evidence that they have, after they've been exposed, they have neurocognitive deficits, and this is obviously a big challenge for those patients. So understanding more about what those are, but additionally, I think there's opportunities for interventions, and those are out there, and there's some early clinical studies ongoing. And then the third one, probably the broadest, but the one that may have the most opportunity, is obesity and metabolic syndrome in survivors. And there's a number of, I think diabetes medications that we're now, in the overarching population that are being seen as effective agents to reduce body weight. Some of them may get approved for body weight indication individually. Excuse me. Our patients, it's well described that there's higher rates of obesity and diabetes in the childhood cancer survivor population. The precise mechanisms for that I don't think are quite well understood, and that's an area of active research. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity to look at that, kind of population change as a whole, and then try to apply some of the, medications that are out there to these patients and discuss what might be the best ones, because it's pretty prevalent in our population, just like it is, in the general U.S. population, but it's even higher in our population of survivors. And I think there's things that can be done. It just really hasn't been studied. And I think, again, there's opportunities. What we see in childhood cancer survivors, I think, may also apply to adult survivors of adult cancer. So I think that would be a good one to focus on. And I think probably a lot of industry interest, because there's so many different things that they have in the pipeline, would be really interesting to see what they thought.
Well, we are so grateful for your time and your expertise and your really unique perspective on this issue in particular, and more broadly about reducing late effects for pediatric cancer treatments. And so we thank you very much, and we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. It was fun interview.
Thank you.
I'll always talk about late effects.